Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons, and in this video lecture we're going to go into chapters 5 and 6. So I've combined both of those chapters because they both have to do with different varieties of plants that live in the ocean. Chapter 5 more gets into the very tiny types of plants, and chapter 6 gets into the larger plants. And a plant that we'll talk a lot about is what you see here. This is a giant kelp. And this is what's called a kelp bass, which makes sense because it lives inside of kelp. So first of all, let's think a little bit about why marine plants are important, right? So there's a couple really crucial things that they provide, right? So one thing they provide is food, right? So all of the things in the ocean that eat plants, of course, need those things to survive. The things that eat those other things, then by the substitution property, they also need plants. Basically, plants are the basis of food webs, both in the ocean and on land. Another reason why marine plants are really important is because of oxygen. So they produce oxygen through the process of photosynthesis, and approximately 50% of the oxygen that is in our atmosphere comes from plants in the ocean, right? So every time you breathe, 50% of the oxygen you're getting into your lungs is coming from plants in the ocean. So that's really quite important. I think that's important at least because I like breathing oxygen. Okay, so plants in the ocean are primary producers. And what are they? Right, so they have the word producer in it, so it means they're making something. And primary meaning that they are the first of something. So they are essentially the first organisms in ecosystems or in food webs that produce sugars, right? So they are autotrophs, right? And this is a term we learned back in chapter 4, right? Things that are able to produce their own food, essentially. And because of that, they form the basis of food webs. Maybe a better way to put that is that they form the foundation of a food web, right? Everything else in a food web kind of relies on them. Kind of in the same way that a foundation that in terms of buildings, the foundation is the really heavy concrete thing that's in the ground that the rest of the building stands on top of, right? So you can't have a building without a foundation underneath it. And so primary producers are kind of like that foundation. So in this diagram here, we see a food web of, let's see, this would be the Antarctic Ocean. So that's the Southern Ocean, I should say. The reason why I was able to figure that out so quickly is because it has penguins. Penguins are only found in the Antarctic. So you find them south of the equator, not north of the equator. Except for in one place in the Galapagos Islands, there's actually a penguin that lives at the equator. But in general, penguins are to the south. So this is in the Southern Ocean. And these guys down here, the diatoms and other phytoplankton, right? So these are the primary producers, right? These are the things that photosynthesize, take sunlight, and produce sugars using it. And then small animals come along and eat those things. And then bigger animals or monstrous animals come along and eat those things. And then other larger things come along and eat those, and so on and so forth, all the way going up to the top of these food webs where killer whales or orcas are the very top of the food webs in the Southern Ocean. And so some examples of primary producers are like these things: diatoms, phytoplankton, like the kelp that I showed you in that picture at the beginning. It's those things. So first, before we get into different types of plants in the ocean, I want to make sure that you understand really clearly what goes on with photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, first of all, what are the things that it uses? So there are kind of two main physical ingredients, and then there's the energy source for it. So the energy source is obviously sunlight, and the actual physical ingredients that go into it include water and carbon dioxide. And so for marine plants, there's water all around them, so no problem getting water. And then there's carbon dioxide that is dissolved into the water, right? So we learned back in one of the earlier chapters that water is really good at dissolving gases. And so in the ocean, one of the gases dissolved into it is carbon dioxide. And then the things that photosynthesis produces, right? So it produces sugars, obviously, and then it produces oxygen, which to the plants that make it is kind of a byproduct. Uh, but for us, that's really great because, as you all know, we need to breathe oxygen in order to survive. So it produces sugars and it produces oxygen. And then another thing I wanted to teach you about, and you'll learn a little bit more about this in the lab on marine algae. All plants and marine plants, for that matter, require photosynthetic pigments, and so these are molecules that are actually in charge of absorbing the light that is coming from the sun. So they're the actual thing that is actually catching the little photons of light as those photons, rush towards the Earth from the sun. And there's a lot of different pigments that are involved here. Chlorophyll A is the main one. So it's kind of like the center of the whole show. Then there's chlorophyll B and C. They kind of act kind of to help out chlorophyll A. And then there's a whole bunch of things that are known as accessory pigments, which kind of take energy from the sun and transfer it to chlorophyll. I kind of think of all these as like a baseball team. Chlorophyll A is like the pitcher on the field. Chlorophyll B and C, those are like infielders, and then the accessory pigments are more like the outfielders, right? So at the end of each play in baseball, the ball eventually goes back to the pitcher, right? So the other chlorophylls like B and C and the accessory pigments, their job is in a way to kind of get the ball back to the pitcher. Of course, it might go to some other bases first before that. Don't worry, I do actually know how baseball works, but that's kind of I think a good analogy for this. So let's talk a little bit more about what those pigments are doing. So those pigments are kind of fulfilling different roles, right? Like I said before, chlorophyll A is the main pigment, but the way that but a lot of why those other pigments are so useful is because they are absorbing different types of light from the light that chlorophyll A absorbs. So first, let's talk a little bit about the nature of light, right? So there are different wavelengths of light, and that's why we perceive light to come in different colors, right? So purple light is light that is of a wavelength of 400 nanometers. And by wavelength, I'm talking about a very similar wavelength to what we're talking about in terms of waves in the ocean. It's just that these wavelengths are, microscopic. So 400 nanometers. So that a nanometer is 1 billionth of a meter, and a meter is about 3 feet. So you can imagine 400 1 billionths of a meter is a very, very small wavelength. So 400 nanometers gives us purple light, 700 gives us red. You've probably heard of an acronym that describes this spectrum of light. It's called Roy G. Biv. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Right? So this is the Roy G. Biv spectrum. And different photosynthetic pigments will absorb different wavelengths of light. So where you see that like chlorophyll A is this curve right here. And the higher the curve, the more of the light that it's absorbing. So chlorophyll A is really good at absorbing purple light and kind of indigo light and a little bit of blue light. So that's the light that it's actually using in order to photosynthesize. Then along here, it's not using really any of this light. So it's using more like it's not using these greens and these yellows and these orange. And then it is using quite a lot of red light. So it's absorbing red light. And then whereas chlorophyll B, it's shifted a little bit different. Chlorophyll B doesn't use much in the way of purple light, but it uses a lot more indigo and blue light. And it uses darker reds versus it uses more orange, whereas chlorophyll A uses more kind of red. And then carotenoids, these are things that are so these are one of those accessory pigments. And carotenoids include things like keratin, which you find a lot of in carrots, which is why carrots have this kind of orangish color. And carotenoids, they absorb kind of light along here, so purple, indigo, violet, indigo, blue, a little bit of green, and then they don't absorb any of the rest of this light. So with the plant having all of these different types of photosynthetic pigments, it means that they can absorb a broader expanse of light. If a plant just had chlorophyll A, it could only absorb light in this band right here and then in this band. But by having those other pigments, it can absorb more of these lights. Okay, and so then this has this tells us something important about why objects have color and why plants have particular colors. Right, so if you look at the leaves of pretty much any plant, you will find that their leaves are greenish in color. And so that might seem confusing based on what I told you a minute ago, right? So I told you how chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, they absorb like purple light, indigo light, blue light, and they absorb more kind of orangish and red light. They are not absorbing this green and yellow light. So what's going on there is that if they're not absorbing this light, the green and yellow light, what they're actually doing is reflecting it. So it's bouncing off of them and going back out into the atmosphere. So the color that we perceive objects to be is based on what they're actually reflecting back out into the atmosphere. So for instance, if an object is not absorbing green light, if it's bouncing green light back out away from it, then we perceive that object to be green. If an object is red, what it means is going on is that it's bouncing that reddish light back out into the atmosphere. If an object is purple, it means that it's bouncing that purple light out into the atmosphere. So the color that we perceive something to be is based on what it's actually not absorbing. It's based on what it's reflecting back into the atmosphere. Whereas then the other lights are what are actually being absorbed by that object. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at an object, in the room that you're in right now, and think to yourself, what are the light wavelengths that it is reflecting, and what are the white wavelengths that are absorbing? In the case of plants in general, they don't absorb a lot of green light, which is why a lot of plants have a greenish color. So in the case of a lot of marine plants, they tend to come in a much greater variety of colors than do plants on land. Or at least if you think about the plant as a whole, of course flowers, come in a lot of different colors. But in terms of the part of the plant that's actually photosynthesizing, marine plants come in a lot of different colors, from red to green to kind of brownish, almost purple-ish color. And so why these different colors? The reason for that is because they have different photosynthetic pigments. Right? So we talked about how there are these different types of pigments, and the type of pigment that you have is going to affect what color you are. Right? So this plant is very reddish, meaning that it reflects a lot of red light back out into the atmosphere. This is green, so that means it is absorbing a lot of like blue and indigo and violet, and it's absorbing a lot of red, and it's reflecting green. This one's more kind of purplish. That means that it's reflecting purple, and it's absorbing the other wavelengths of light. So the different colors are based on the pigments that they have. Okay, so let's talk about, now that you know a little bit more about how marine plants do what they do, that is photosynthesizing, let's talk about the different groups of them. So first we'll talk a little bit about the phytoplankton. So these are the tiniest types of marine primary producers. So these are single-celled algae. Then later on in the chapter, in this lecture, we'll talk about macroalgae, macro meaning large. These are the multicellular algae. So they're just the larger varieties of the phytoplankton. And these are what we in general refer to as seaweeds. And then finally, the very last group we'll talk about in this lecture are the actual plants. So these are multicellular plants that are similar in all ways to the plants that you find on land. It's just that they are living in the ocean rather than on land. And we'll talk about this water vascular system thing that they have that makes them different from these other groups. Okay, so first we'll talk about phytoplankton. So like I said before, they're the single-celled relatives of seaweeds. And they include tiny things like diatoms. That's what you see in this picture here. Diatoms, these groups that are known as dinoflagellates, and then a bunch of other different groups that we're not going to get into because they're not nearly as common as diatoms and dinoflagellates. But diatoms, they are by far the most abundant, right? So they are definitely the most abundant photosynthesizing thing on the planet. In fact, most of that 50% of oxygen I talked about in the atmosphere is coming from diatoms. So diatoms, like I said, very abundant. That's a lot of why they're really so important, is because their sheer volume. So if you were to go, out to Santa Monica Pier and just scoop up water from the ocean, into a water bottle, you would catch millions of individual diatoms. They are just so incredibly abundant in all of the oceans everywhere on the planet. Just super, super abundant. And they come in a lot of varieties, right? So they can sometimes be solitary. So these are all individual diatoms, whereas this is a chain of diatoms, right? Each one of these little squares is one individual diatom that is in a colony. So they can be colonial or they can be solitary. And why they have that kind of yellowish brownish color that you saw is because they have a lot of carotenoids in them. So remember, carotenoids, sorry, that's misspelled there. Carotenoids are one of those accessory pigments that give plants more kind of a yellowish, orangish, kind of reddish color, as opposed to chlorophyll, which gives plants more of a greenish color. And how diatoms are kind of built is it's kind of like a box. So you have the top part of a box and the bottom part of a box. And they just kind of fit together, and then all of the stuff that they need is all inside of that. So the nucleus with the DNA, the chloroplast, that's where photosynthesis takes place. They have a lot of oil in them, which helps keep them buoyant. So they've got all those important things inside of them. You might actually find what's known as diatomaceous earth in your house, believe it or not, or apartment. So the shells of diatoms are made of silica, which is essentially, a very powdery form of glass. And there are deposits of these silica shells in different areas of the planet, where there's this really fine powdery glass-like stuff that's called diatomaceous earth. And these are used in a lot of products, for instance, in a lot of toothpaste. So what I want you to do after you're done watching this video lecture is go to your cupboard or cabinet in your bathroom and take a look at your toothpaste to see if you have diatomaceous earth in it. Why it's used in products such as toothpastes is to buff surfaces, right? So those tiny little bits of shell are really good at, scraping grime off of surfaces. And so that's really good for cleaning stuff, essentially, which is why you find them in toothpaste. Okay, now let's switch and talk a little bit about dinoflagellates. So the word dinoflagellate doesn't refer to dinosaurs farting. What it refers to instead are dino, in this case, means two, so the prefix di means two, and flagellates refers to flagella, which are small kind of whip-like things that are used for locomotion. So dinoflagellates have two flagella that are in grooves along their body, which allows them to move around. And so that's what makes them different from diatoms, is diatoms don't have that. They basically can't steer and move themselves around, whereas dinoflagellates can. Some dinoflagellates are bioluminescent. Actually, even pretty recently, back in, it's probably like March, in April of 2020, that there was a lot of dinoflagellates making bioluminescent water off the coast of Southern California. Bioluminescence is essentially when marine organisms, or organisms on land for that matter, they produce either a dye or a chemical that makes them glow. So all this glowing right here are actually dinoflagellates making the water glow. If you have Netflix and you haven't yet watched the docu-series Night on Earth, I would highly recommend the ocean the ocean episode. It shows some really nice bioluminescence of dinoflagellates in that particular episode. Dinoflagellates, they are useful not just because they make really pretty looking water, but they also do something really important in tropical coral reefs. So dinoflagellates, in one particular type of them known as this word, which is zooxanthellae. So if you just take the X and pronounce it like a Z, then this is basically spelled out phonetically. So it's zooxanthellae is how we pronounce that. And what they do is they have a symbiotic relationship with corals. And what is going on there, so this is a coral, so this is a table coral that one might find in the South Pacific. And what goes on there is that the coral, which is an animal, is what's giving the physical structure that you see here. And you'll learn more about corals when we get into chapter 7. And so the corals give a physical structure, and the zooxanthellae live inside of the corals. So the corals are providing a shelter to their zooxanthellae. The zooxanthellae, in return, produce sugars from photosynthesis, and they give a lot of those sugars to the corals. So there's kind of this mutual relationship going on where the zooxanthellae give sugars to the corals, and the corals give a shelter to the zooxanthellae. So it's a classic symbiotic relationship. Both partners get a benefit out of it. And if it wasn't for this relationship, you would not find corals in the abundance that you can find them in tropical seas throughout our oceans. They just wouldn't be able to exist in the abundance that you find them there. Okay, one last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of phytoplankton are microalgal blooms. So phytoplankton can oftentimes bloom, meaning that they get up into very high abundance very, very rapidly. And what typically causes this is spikes in nutrients. So just like plants on land, the more nutrients you give them, the faster and bigger they will grow. So when there is a big pulse of nutrients that go into the ocean, you'll see a big bloom of phytoplankton. And so these can actually be harmful to marine organisms and actually even to humans. So for instance, there is a type of dinoflagellate that you can find off our coastline here actually called Pfisteria. And this dinoflagellate, it produces some toxins. And so what can happen is kind of picture this scenario. So there's a big bloom of the Pfisteria, and they're all producing toxins. And say the water currents move that Pfisteria over a bed of mussels, right? So mussels are, kind of like clams. And then those clams or mussels, so they eat the Pfisteria, and now they have the toxin inside of them. And so that toxin isn't so harmful to clams or mussels, but then say a human comes along and eats one of those mussels or clams. That can actually cause what's known as paralytic shellfish poisoning, which can attack the nervous system of a human. It can even kill them if it's really severe. So that's why it's really important to know where, if you eat seafood, particularly mussels or clams or oysters, it's really important to make sure that they're coming from a good source. That it's not just like, I don't know, some sketchy guy selling oysters out of the back of his, van, like on the hush. Like if you eat seafood, then make sure it's like coming from like a good vendor, because you don't want to get paralytic shellfish poisoning, or just general food poisoning for that matter. And so there's actually a movie that relates to this, believe it or not. And that movie is actually Alfred Hitchcock's classic thriller called The Birds. And so if you've seen this movie, you'll know that essentially what happens is that a bunch of birds go berserk and start attacking people in the town of Bodega Bay, California. And this was actually based on real events. So what happened in the real story is that there was a bloom of Pfisteria. It got into shellfish, so like clams and mussels in that area. Seagulls ate a bunch of those and went crazy because the Pfisteria affects them just like it affects us humans. And so seagulls started going crazy. They were just like they're dying in the street, crashing into buildings and cars, and that inspired Alfred Hitchcock to make this movie. But he changed the birds from being seagulls to being crows because, you know, crows, I guess, are a lot scarier than seagulls. But anyway, that's what inspired Alfred Hitchcock to make that movie. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about macroalgae. So these are the larger cousins of the diatoms and the dinoflagellates that we just talked about. So these things, in a lot of ways, they are like the typical plants that we find, on land, but they're just kind of simpler versions of them. So macroalgae, they don't have true leaves in the way that plants on land do. They don't have real stems. They don't have real roots. And probably the most important thing is they don't have a vascular system like plants, like true plants do. And so vascular systems include things that have, it includes a system within a body of an organism that is essentially a series of tubes with liquid inside of it, right? So we have a vascular system, right? So I think you probably should be thinking, oh, that sounds kind of like veins and arteries and blood inside of us, and that's right, right? So we have a cardiovascular system that is used for transporting stuff around our body through our blood. So regular plants that you see like outside your window, like right now, those are plants that have a vascular system. They have a series of tubes throughout their bodies that are used for moving water and sugars around, right? So true plants have that. Macroalgae like this kelp, they don't have anything like that. They don't have any system for transporting stuff around throughout their body. They just can't do it. Okay, so let's take a look at the structure of a kelp in this case. So the whole like body of a macroalgae is referred to as a thallus, or the thallus of a seaweed or algae. The blades are the things that are kind of like leaves, so those are the flattened areas, and that's where most of the photosynthesis is occurring. Although it actually occurs throughout the whole entire thallus of a seaweed. But these blades are different from leaves in that leaves on a true plant have a series of water canals running through them, whereas the blades of a seaweed do not have that. The stipe is kind of like the stem-like structure, but it doesn't have a tube running through it with water and sugar going through it, so it's not like a real stem on a true plant. Okay, something that a lot of macroalgae have, not all, but a lot have, is what's known as a nematocyst. And nematocyst refers to a sac with air in it, and that's essentially used for buoyancy. So on this seaweed here, so this is a cartoon of giant kelp, which you can find off of our coastlines here in California. At the base of each blade on a giant kelp is a nematocyst. So there's this air-filled sac, and what that does is it makes it float up. So it's attached on the sea floor, but then the rest of the kelp will float up towards the surface. And the obvious benefit is that you're closer to the sunlight, and so you can photosynthesize more, right? So that's why they have those nematocysts, is to keep them closer, is to hold them up towards the sun. Finally, the holdfast of a macroalgae is like the root-like thing. But it's different from a root in that roots will dig into the ground, right? So like the roots of a sequoia tree, for instance, will dig really deep into the ground and really wide around it. Whereas the holdfast of a macroalgae doesn't actually penetrate into the seafloor. It just clamps onto just whatever the surface of the seafloor is like in that area, which is why you actually find a lot of macroalgae, washed up on the shore, because holdfasts just don't work quite as well as actual roots do. Because if you're a kelp and your holdfast attaches to a rock, and that rock is just kind of small, then you're kind of out of luck, because that rock can be swept to the shoreline. So macroalgae come in a lot of shapes and sizes. What I showed you just before is all the different features that a macroalgae can have. A lot of them don't have all of those things, right? So like this stuff here, which is known as ulva, is really just a holdfast in a single blade. There's no nematocyst, there's no stipe. This stuff right under here is what's known as enteromorpha. It doesn't even really have blades so much. It just has a bunch of little strings that are attached to the ground. It's kind of just like a bunch of stipes and in a holdfast holding it to the seafloor. So they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And there are three major groups of algae, and they come in three names that are very easy to remember. So the first group that we'll talk about are green algae. And so green algae are things that are obviously green. And what kind of sets them apart from the others is two things. One thing that sets them apart from the other macroalgae is that they tend to be able to reach really great abundance. So they're really good at blooming. So just like microalgae, things like diatoms and dinoflagellates can bloom, macroalgae can do the same. And it's often green algae that does this. So they can reach really great abundance. They tend to have a lot of chlorophyll A and B, which is why they are very greenish in color, not as many accessory pigments as some of the other algae have. And the other thing that really makes them very different from the other macroalgae is that they have starch and cellulose. So starch and cellulose are two different types of sugars. And so green algae produce these. The other types of algae, red and brown algae, do not. And true plants that we find on land have starch and cellulose, which is a good indication that green algae are the ancestors of plants on land. Right, so when you see a green seaweed at the ocean, if you go to the beach, what you are seeing is essentially the ancestor of all of the plants that you find on land, right? So all of the palm trees and the sequoias and the Joshua trees, like in this picture, and the cacti, all of those things, their ancestor are green algae in the ocean. So here's a picture showing you just how great the abundance of green algae can get. And so you can see this whole shoreline is just covered in mats of green algae. There's just an absolute crap ton of it. And why they can do this so well is that they're great at sucking up nutrients out of the water. When there's a pulse of nutrients, the green algae go berserk and just suck it up and get into these really high abundances. So it's often these things. It could be other types of algae that will bloom as well, but it tends to be the greens that do it the most. And so why I like talking about blooms of algae so much is that it's kind of near and dear to my heart because the very first research project I ever did when I was a young marine biologist, probably pretty close in age to a lot of you right now. I worked on macroalgae on the outer shorelines of Cape Cod. So Cape Cod is part of Massachusetts. So like Boston up here where the Red Sox play, that's where that is. Down here is where the Patriots play, which you probably all hate. I grew up right here, so I don't hate either of those teams. In fact, I like those teams. So sorry if that sullies your opinion of me, but that's just how it is. And so I worked out here in Cape Cod for the NPS, which is the National Park Service. And these outer shorelines get covered in algae every year. And so the locals out there really hate it because it's not great for tourism. Nobody wants to go sit at a beach that is covered in algae. So essentially the National Park Service hired me to study what was going on, to try to figure out what are the types of algae that are on the shorelines there, and to figure out where it might be coming from and why it's blooming. And so what myself and the other people that I worked with at the National Park Service figured out was that most of the algae in Cape Cod was this leafy green type, which, like I was telling you before, is what you typically find when there is big blooms of algae. When there's big spikes in nutrients, you tend to find a lot of green algae. And then on top of that, there was also some of this filamentous. By filamentous, I mean kind of stringy, kind of red and brown algae. So it's kind of a mix of these different types. And the kind of more important thing is why they're getting so much of it. And so the kind of hypothesis that we concluded with is that all along the shoreline here, there's not a lot of hard surfaces for algae to attach to. So algae in general need a hard surface that they can cling to as they are growing. And you don't find a lot of that here, meaning that this algae has to be coming from somewhere else. So if you look at a map of the currents in that area, by currents I mean how water is moving around, you find that in this area, which is the Gulf of Maine, the water is kind of going in a counterclockwise fashion. So it's spinning around this way and going right past Cape Cod, which is down here. In Cape Cod, it has all of these sandbars. So you see these things that are kind of extending out from the shoreline. So that's accumulated sand. And all those sandbars kind of act as nets. So as algae is rushing past, in these currents, they get kind of trapped by these sandbars. And what we essentially found is where there was the most of the algae is where there was the most of these sandbars. Right, so it's more kind of correlation than causation, but we're pretty confident that that's what's going on, is that this algae is drifting all throughout this area, and Cape Cod just happens to act as a kind of net that captures that algae as it drifts past. Okay, so that's algae that's not particularly great because it covers the seashore and nobody really likes it. But green algae can actually be far more insidious. So sometimes they can be invasive. Invasive means something that has come from somewhere else that humans have brought to a new place. And when they go from that old place to the new place, they start to cause damage in that new place. And so Caulerpa taxifolia is a really good example of this. So this green algae, it was introduced by accident into the Mediterranean Sea. It's actually native more to the Indian Ocean. So it was introduced into the Mediterranean Sea by accident by the Jacques Cousteau aquarium on the French coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. It spread throughout the Mediterranean, smothering other plants and algae and causing big problems. And it's been found in Southern California. So it's been found in Carlsbad, and it's been found at Huntington Harbor and Beach. There's been major efforts to make sure it doesn't spread because it is such a damaging invasive species. And it doesn't seem like, from the last time I looked into this, it doesn't seem like it's spreading too much right now. But there is certainly the potential for it to do so like it has in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, let's talk a little bit about brown algae. So these are algae that have a lot of what's known as fucoxanthin. So that's an accessory pigment, and that accessory pigment gives brown algae their brownish color. So they still have chlorophyll A and B, but that huge amount of fucoxanthin makes them very, very brownish in appearance. So these things are typically found in cold, shallow waters, such as like we have here in Southern California. Right, so this is a brown algae that I'm holding in this picture. This is what's known as a bullwhip kelp. And let's see, this picture was in Santa Cruz, so kind of in Central California. So these things can be quite big. So they can grow as much as 300 feet long. Bullwhip kelp doesn't get quite that long, but giant kelp can get that long. And so let's talk a little bit about those kelps because they are, kind of interesting. Or at least noteworthy for their size. So kelps, we find them just in cold or polar locations, so very, very cold water to moderately cold water. And the giant kelp, which is known as Macrocystis, which is what you see in both of these pictures, are the largest. And so you have probably seen, or there's a good chance that you have actually seen giant kelp from the shore. So if you were driving along the Pacific Coast Highway, the brownish stuff that you see, like kind of floating just offshore, maybe like 200 feet offshore, you are looking at the top of giant kelp that is extending from the seafloor all the way up to the surface. And kelp forests are by far the most productive marine communities that we have off the coast of California. And why they're so productive is because they tend to be pretty nutrient rich because they're close to shore. And if you look in this picture, you see there is a ton of places where a fish or something without a backbone could hide, right? So there's just a tremendous amount of places for fishes and invertebrates to hide inside of kelp forests. So that is a lot of why they're so productive. By productive, I mean having a lot of things living there. Okay, then finally there's the red algae. So these have pigments that make them kind of reddish in appearance, right? You can see in all these cases they're all kind of reddish. So they still have chlorophyll A and B, but they also have these red pigments together. And there's kind of something important going on with red algae. So red algae are able to live at much greater depths than the other type of algae are. And there's an important reason for that. And it kind of has to do with what we talked about before about absorbing versus reflecting light. And it has to do with the nature of how light penetrates into the ocean. Okay, so first let's talk about, as a refresher of what we talked about a little while ago. So remember, if an object is red, if an object appears red to us, it means that it is reflecting red and it is absorbing the other wavelengths of light. Meaning that if a plant is red, it is not actually using red in order to photosynthesize. It is actually using the other wavelengths of light and absorbing the other wavelengths of light to photosynthesize. So red algae, for instance, does not use red, but it kind of specializes in using kind of purple to blue to dark green light. So that is the light that it actually uses in order to photosynthesize. That's the light that it absorbs when photosynthesizing. It also happens to be the case that indigo and purple and blue and dark green light is the light that will penetrate the deepest into the ocean. So different wavelengths of light don't get as far into the ocean. So like red light, for instance, once you get below 25 feet depth, there is no more red light from the sun. All the red light basically gets absorbed. It gets scattered by the stuff that is in the water. So all that red light goes away. But once you get down to depths of 100 plus feet, everything kind of looks bluish. And the reason for that is because it's only the blue and kind of purple and dark green light that actually can get down to those depths. I've got a pretty good anecdote kind of related to this. One time, maybe in like 2012 or 13, I was spearfishing for lionfish, which you learned about. You learned about how they're a kind of harmful invasive species. I was spearfishing for them in the Caribbean. I was down at probably about 75 feet depth, and I accidentally cut myself on my spear. So what color do you think my blood would have looked like at 75 feet depth? So remember, there's no red light down there. And so it actually looked kind of like a dark green color. It was really, really weird. It was really creepy. I actually didn't know that it was blood at first. I thought there was some weird thing coming out of me in that I was a non-human or something like that. But then I remembered, oh, I'm at depth. There's no more red light down here. That's why my blood looks this kind of greenish color, is because of the lack of red light down there. So red algae, they can live down at these great depths because they specialize in using this light that is still found at great depths. Whereas like green algae use a lot of kind of reddish light, and they use a lot of like the ultraviolet, like purple light. So that means that they can really only be up close to the surface because they need that light, which is only found at the surface. So they're found only in deeper waters due to their pigments. Okay, so macroalgae, believe it or not, have a lot of commercial uses to them, right? So there are some that we eat directly, right? So for instance, if you've ever had sushi, the dark green wrapper around it is nori, which is a type of seaweed. If you've ever had seaweed salad, which which are found at a lot of restaurants, and especially like seafood restaurants, that is wakame, which is a type of green algae. And you also find a lot of chemicals from algae inside of products, inside of like home products. So what these chemicals are often used for is making products more gelatinous, right? So if you could think of anything that is kind of liquidy, but has or something that would have maybe started liquidy, but there's an agent in it that makes it a little more gelatinous, a little more viscous. Oftentimes it's algae that is used for that. So for instance, the products carrageenan, agar, algin, those are all things that are used to thicken, things like toothpaste, for instance. So when you go to check your toothpaste for diatomaceous earth, I want you to check it for these things as well. So if you find any of these, you are essentially brushing your teeth with macroalgae, with seaweeds. And there's a huge list of things that often have agar or carrageenan in them, right? They're all kind of things that, they're all kind of like kind of thick, kind of liquidy things like ice cream or infant formula or yogurt, right? A lot of these things have carrageenan or agar or algin inside of them to act as a thickening agent. Right, because you don't want, yogurt that is liquidy, and you don't want ice cream that is liquidy. So oftentimes carrageenan is used to make those things a little bit thicker. Okay, so we're gonna stop there for this video lecture, and then the next video lecture we'll do chapter 6, which is then having to do with the marine flowering plants.